Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm a programmer and an artist, and I have several things I want to show you today from different stuff I've been working on this week. The first one's a trick I figured out about geometry nodes. I don't know if you've ever run into the problem where you're trying to make something and you set up materials on your object, but then you use geometry nodes to generate some of the geometry. And somewhere in the process of going through the node tree, Blender essentially forgets about the materials you put in your object because they're actually attached to the object data of the input mesh rather than the newly generated geometry, something like that. So I have a new node group here, and we just need to generate some geometry. So let's add, a sphere or something. So you can see now if we plug this sphere into the geometry output, it turns white, and it doesn't actually have a material on it anymore. So when they first added the material nodes, the way I expected this to work is that you could add a set material at index node, or set material index rather, and you could change the material index and it would pick between the materials that were assigned to your mesh. But obviously that doesn't work, and I think the reason for that is behind the scenes this UV sphere is actually a separate mesh data from what our input geometry was. Now, one way around this is you can change the material from being linked to the data to being linked to the object. And then you can set the material index and it will update, I think. But the annoying thing is you have to do that for every single material slot. Oh, it doesn't even work, so never mind. That's not even possible either. So anyway, it's just kind of clunky and doesn't work the way I expected it to, and so I hardly ever use set material index. I don't know if there's a different way you're supposed to use it. I guess I'd be curious to know that, but I haven't been able to figure it out. What I did figure out that you can do is we can join the original mesh data with the new sphere, and now we can use set material index. Once we've joined the geometry together, just note that the order that the materials will be in depends on which mesh was connected to the joined geometry first. You can see here 0 is the white from the UV sphere and 1 is red. If you want instead that default material to be at the end, you have to attach the UV sphere underneath the input geometry. So that's kind of cool and allows us to use the materials from our original object data, but obviously we might not want the plane in there. And what we can do about that is just add a capture attribute to be a boolean before we join the geometry. And we just set that to true. And then after we join the geometry, we can delete geometry. And then we can just connect that attribute to the selection. Of course, it would help if we connected it to the right geometry. So anyway, that's just something I realized the other day and thought would be useful, because now what we can do is we can have these objects, we can just set the material index to 0 and we can get rid of all these materials, but then we can duplicate this object and change the thread material to green, and both of these objects are using the geometry nodes to generate a mesh, but we're assigning the material in the normal material panel, and it's able to use it. So I think that's pretty cool. Neat little trick to know about. Alright, the second thing I wanted to show was a new operator that I added to my Utilities Addon, which is just a little add-on with a handful of useful operators to do various things. And that's available on Gumroad if you want to check it out. So what the new operator does is, I don't know if anyone uses the knife project tool. I use it sometimes. And essentially what it allows you to do is take some edges and use them to cut into your mesh. The problem is it doesn't work in edit mode. So the only way to use it is to have an edge selected, separate it to a new geometry, or this is the fastest way I found to use it, is to duplicate an edge, place it where you want to cut, separate it to a new geometry, then run knife project, which makes the cut, but doesn't select it, and then you have this mesh out here which you need to clean up and delete. So essentially what the operator I added does is it automates that process. So what I think is especially useful for is two things. One is you have two-dimensional shapes that are in the same plane that you want to merge together. So normally if you were to do this, you might add like a loop cut and then slide it over and turn the snapping on. And you could like snap this here. So you could do a cut and a cut. So what the knife project allows you to do is let you take that same starting point where you have two overlapping quads, or any geometry really, and you can run knife project on the selection, and what it will do is it'll take the mesh that you have selected in edit mode, do that whole process of separating, doing the knife project and everything, but all in one step, and it lets you stay in edit mode while you do it. So by default, it deletes the cutting geometry. So if you like duplicate an edge and then place it somewhere and use that to cut, you probably just want to delete the edge afterwards. In this case, we just want to merge those two quads together, so we can turn delete cutter geometry off, which brings back our quads. If you turn merge verts off, then these will be two separate objects still, but they will have cuts where the other one intersected it. And then cut through is just the option on the normal knife project tool, whether it cuts all the way through a mesh or not. So if instead we have this geometry here where these two planes are on top of each other, then if we run the knife project, it'll cut through to both of them. Whereas if you run it with cut through turned off, then it only cuts the first one it finds and doesn't continue through. So again, if we have something like this and we run knife project, it merges all the verts together, so this is a single quad, and it selects the geometry that was added, which makes it nicer if you want to then edit it immediately afterwards. And then the other thing that's really useful to do with it is just to make like an edge. Say you wanted to cut this here for some reason, well then you can run knife project on that, and you can delete the cutter geometry, and then you just have it cut through like this. I've primarily used it on two-dimensional things, or things that I'm extruding into 3 dimensions after, but what I'm editing is just 2-dimensional. It's probably harder to use if you're working with 3-dimensional things, but if you're just wanting to like cut a corner off of something, if you want to cut all the way through, I imagine it would work pretty well. So anyway, it's just a slightly improved version of the standard knife project tool that comes with Blender, and hopefully that'll be useful to somebody. Alright, the third thing I want to show was the script that I made. So this week I was doing some work on some UI stuff for my game, and the UI stuff's hard because there's a lot of little elements and pieces of buttons and stuff that have to stack on top of each other, and they all have to be rendered as separate UI sprites, and they're all different sizes, and you want to see what they all look like stacked on top of each other. But you can't render them that way because you need like the color. If you want to be able to adjust the color in Unity, you need that to be a separate layer that's going to be stacked. Or if you want to be able to turn different elements of it on or off, like these are all icons for abilities, but the ability might be disabled, or it might not be active, or it could be selected or hovered over. And I want to reflect all of those different states somehow. So anyway, it's just a problem of managing all of the different versions of buttons and stuff. And I also had made some parts a long time ago and had things in different files and stuff. And when I had rendered those, I had a camera set up for the different elements. So there were multiple cameras set with different orthographic scales to render the size of different items, but then you also had to adjust the resolution of your render. And then you had to toggle the render visibility of certain things on or off so that only the one thing you wanted to render would be on. And all of that was kind of a pain. So I ended up making this blend file where it's all managed in one place. You can design it looking at the view as it should appear in game. And then all of the different elements go in collections. And then each of those collections can be instanced separately in this exploded view over here where they can be set up to rendered. Then I have this animation at the bottom, moves the camera around to all of the different elements. And then the script manages the output names and resolutions and everything and can render them all at once. So if we run the script, it registers to the Blender app handlers for when the frame is changed and when the render is complete and stuff. On the camera, there's properties to control it all. So you can configure the orthographic scale in the X and Y directions, which also ends up updating the resolution. So now if we cycle between frames, you can see that the render resolution changes, and that's driven by these scale X and Y values that are animated, because you can't animate the resolution value. It says can't be animated. So that updates as you go through all the different elements that need different sizes and things. You can animate the materials changing for if you want to render a white mask or something like that. And then I made this handy gizmo where you can measure in the scene how large something is. So you can see this is 1.1 by 1.13. So then you can go in the camera to the camera properties. You can animate the scale X and Y values to match those numbers. So what's really cool about that is I can go back later and just looking at this original view where I can see everything. I can adjust some colors or make a change to a material. And then it will update and reflect those changes across all of the different elements that I need. And then if you go to the first frame and you check render all on the custom properties of the camera, when you press render, it goes through and will render every single frame. So essentially what happens is when it completes the first render, that causes an event to fire, which triggers it to move to the next frame, update all of the settings, and then render again. All of the different elements are named whatever the name of the marker on that frame is. So you can name all of the different elements, and then what we get at the end is this folder full of all of the different images. So if I just go back to the beginning here and I select one of these materials, and we just add add an emission shader and make it green or something, then I can render everything again. Renders that first frame and then renders all of the other frames. And if we look at that elements folder again, you can see all of the elements now are rendered in green. So anyway, that's what I've got so far. I think it's a huge improvement over what I was doing before, which was basically manually rendering and saving images and customizing resolutions as I went, which means that if you wanted to go back and redo any of that work, it was impossible, because how am I supposed to remember what I set all of those to the first time I did it? And that meant that I was afraid to change anything about the UI because it was so much work trying to remake stuff. But now all of the things that can change are saved as keyframes here, so that's a good improvement. I will upload a version of this file with the script in it to my Blender experiments on Gumroad if you want to download and try it out. Note it's kind of buggy still. The is rendering doesn't always reset, so after you render you should uncheck that. And it's also not very user-friendly, because if you want to change anything about it, you'll have to edit this script, so you'll need to know some scripting stuff. But you're welcome to try it out and customize it for something similar that you're trying to do, I guess. So anyway, it is what it is. I've got a bunch of different stuff on Gumroad you can check out if you haven't. I've got some more just experimental stuff, which you can test out if you want. I've got a bunch of geometry node assets, which are a bunch of sort of modular modifier things that you can build all kinds of cool stuff with. I've got my Utilities Addon, which just adds some useful operators to normal editing in Blender. I've got some scripts and stuff for transferring animations and objects between Blender and Unity, which is a little more specialized, obviously, and I don't know, some other random stuff. But anyway, hopefully that was interesting. That's all I've got for this one. Thanks for watching.